Prime Minister Mark Carney says Canada will act to protect jobs and diversify markets for industries heavily impacted by tariffs. Canada's softwood lumber industry is among those taking a big hit.
35% on lumber going across the line is just ridiculous. There's over 250 small manufacturing family-run companies like us in BC. It's going to kill thousands of jobs.
The U.S. housing market didn't just slow down. It slammed headfirst into a wall. One day, construction crews across America were framing walls, cutting beams, and pouring foundations. The next, silence. Half-built houses stood like skeletons under the summer sun. Lumber yards sat idle, and the cost of building a home began climbing before the first nail could even be hammered in. The cause? A single, high-voltage move from Washington, a 25% tariff slapped on Canadian lumber, stacked on top of duties already in place. In an instant, some shipments faced almost 40% in combined penalties. Within hours, the shockwave ripped through the economy. America's largest timber giant lost half its profits in a single quarter. Builders froze projects mid-frame. Home buyers saw prices spike overnight. And in Ottawa, Canada's leaders weren't panicking. They were preparing a counterstrike. Because hidden behind polite diplomacy was a trillion-dollar threat, a form of financial leverage so massive that Washington could not afford to ignore it. What began as a trade dispute was morphing into a high-stakes economic war. And if the United States miscalculated, it wouldn't just lose the lumber fight, it could lose permanent access to one of the most critical resources for its own housing future. It didn't happen out of nowhere. The seeds were planted decades ago. For more than 40 years, the United States and Canada have been locked in a bitter, on-and-off battle over softwood lumber. It's a fight that has outlived presidents, prime ministers, trade agreements, and even recessions. But in early 2025, Donald Trump decided it was time to light the match again, only this time, the explosion would be bigger. In a televised announcement, the administration declared a 25% tariff on Canadian softwood lumber. On its own, that would have been devastating, but when stacked on top of existing duties, some shipments were now facing nearly 40% in total penalties. That's like telling a builder every single board they order just got almost half again as expensive overnight. The move wasn't limited to lumber. Certain Canadian energy exports were suddenly hit with a 10% tariff. In Washington's eyes, this was about defending American jobs and leveling the playing field. The U.S. Lumber Coalition claimed Canadian provinces let their mills harvest timber from public land at below-market rates, undercutting U.S. sawmills and driving closures in logging towns from Oregon to Maine. For decades, this accusation had fueled anger in American timber country. Now, Trump was turning that anger into policy. But in Ottawa, the reaction was very different. Canadian officials called it exactly what they believed it was: economic aggression. Behind closed doors, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government began weighing a weapon it hadn't considered in decades: export quotas. It was a nuclear option in trade terms. Restricting lumber shipments to the U.S. would send shockwaves through the American housing market, but it would also hit Canada's own logging towns. Pulling the trigger would mean taking a calculated hit now to gain long-term leverage later. This wasn't just another tariff announcement. It was the opening salvo in a war where both sides were willing to inflict pain, not just on each other, but on themselves, if it meant coming out on top. The first corporate casualty was a name that had stood for more than a century in American forestry: Weyerhaeuser. This wasn't some small-town sawmill. Weyerhaeuser is a timber empire controlling millions of acres of forest and feeding the supply chains of builders from coast to coast. But when the tariffs hit, even a giant stumbled. In a single quarter, profits plunged from $173 million to just $87 million. That's not a dip, that's a collapse. Management issued a grim warning. The next quarter could be $60 million worse. And the problem wasn't just the new tariffs. The housing market was already under pressure. Mortgage rates were at their highest in over a decade. Demand for new homes was slowing. Builders were hesitant to start projects when costs could jump thousands of dollars in a matter of weeks. Industry analysts crunched the numbers and delivered a gut punch. By 2027, The tariffs could add 14,000s to the cost of building a typical new home. For families already pushed to the edge by soaring prices, that was the difference between buying and walking away. The National Association of Home Builders sounded the alarm, calling the move a direct threat to housing affordability. But on the other side, the U.S. Lumber Coalition shrugged. In their view, the short-term pain was worth it to rebuild America's domestic capacity, to bring mills back, to create jobs in logging towns, to stand up to Canadian unfair competition. But here's the danger they didn't fully see. In global trade, markets shift fast. Once a customer finds a new supplier, loyalty doesn't always bring them back. And Canada was already working behind the scenes to make sure those customers wouldn't return to America even if the tariffs disappeared. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc stepped in front of the cameras and dropped a reminder Washington couldn't ignore. Canadian investors hold roughly $1 trillion in U.S. assets, and that number grows by about $100 billion every single year. That's not just money, that's leverage. If Ottawa wanted, it could pull financial levers that would hurt far beyond lumber. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't mince words. He rejected the August 1st deadline outright, saying Canada would not be bullied into a bad deal just to ease U.S. political pressure. Instead, he unleashed a two-track strategy designed to both apply pressure and reduce dependency on America. First, Ottawa quietly signaled it was prepared to limit exports, not just as a threat, but as a real bargaining chip. That would instantly choke supply for U.S. builders already gasping under high material costs. Second, Canada accelerated market diversification at breakneck speed. Lumber that once flowed almost exclusively south began heading east and west, to Europe, to Asia, to anyone willing to sign long-term deals. The shift was dramatic. In just 1 year, the share of Canadian softwood lumber exports going to the U.S. fell from 78% to 68%. European and Asian buyers stepped in, even if that meant paying more for shipping or adapting to Canadian grading standards. Carney's bet was simple. Take the short-term hit now to secure long-term independence. Because once those new trade routes were built and those contracts signed, America wouldn't just have to lift the tariffs, it would have to compete to win back what it once got by default. While Washington doubled down on its tariffs, the rest of the world saw an opening, and they pounced. In Asia, Japan and South Korea moved with lightning speed. Both nations are major importers of softwood lumber, and they knew Canada was looking to lock in alternative markets. Within months, they were at the negotiating table, offering something America had taken for granted for decades: long-term supply commitments. And they weren't just talking about a few years. These were contracts measured in decades, designed to guarantee access for a generation. In Europe, the rush was just as intense. Germany and the Netherlands, already struggling with their own construction booms, saw a chance to secure stable lumber flows from a politically reliable supplier. Their negotiators didn't just want lumber, they wanted priority access written into trade agreements, ensuring that when global supply gets tight, they get served first. And Canada was listening. Every deal signed was another brick in the wall Ottawa was building between its industry and U.S. dependency. The kicker? Currency advantage. The Canadian dollar was trading well below the U.S. dollar, making Canadian lumber a bargain, even with long shipping routes. For a buyer in Europe or Asia, the math was simple: cheaper product, stable partner, locked-in supply. This is what Washington's strategists feared but underestimated, that the tariffs wouldn't just hurt in the short term. They were creating permanent competition for U.S. access. Even if the White House scrapped the tariffs tomorrow, much of that Canadian supply might already be spoken for, committed to ports thousands of miles away. Washington thought it had a plan. If Canadian lumber was suddenly too expensive, the answer seemed simple: cut more trees at home. The Trump administration announced with great fanfare a push to increase logging on U.S. federal lands by 25%. The talking points were clear: boost domestic supply, lower costs, and protect American builders from relying on foreign lumber. But the reality? Forestry economists didn't sugarcoat it. Even if the plan was fully executed, the total increase in available U.S. lumber would barely reach 1% of national demand. Why so little? Because most federal forest land isn't the kind you can just start harvesting. Some areas are too remote. No roads, no infrastructure to move logs. Others hold trees unsuitable for construction-grade lumber. And the rest? Locked up in environmental restrictions that would take years to challenge in court. The lawsuits were inevitable. Environmental groups lined up before the first chainsaw started, ready to block permits and tie the policy up in legal battles for years. Meanwhile, builders needed wood now, not in 2030. And while Washington was promising future supply, Canadian companies were already finding a loophole and exploiting it. Industry giants like West Fraser and Canfor began buying U.S. sawmills outright, especially in states like Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. By operating on American soil, they avoided tariffs completely. They could cut U.S. trees, sell to U.S. builders, and keep their global networks running, all while planting a Canadian flag inside the tariff wall. For some U.S. towns, it was a lifeline. Jobs returned, local economies ticked up. But for domestic mill owners, it was a warning. The competition just got sharper, richer, and better connected. By midsummer, this wasn't just a trade dispute anymore. It was a high-speed collision course. On one side, Washington was betting that sustained economic pain would eventually break Ottawa's resolve. The idea was simple. The longer tariffs stayed in place, the more pressure Canadian mills, workers, and towns would feel until political reality forced Prime Minister Carney to cut a deal. On the other side, Ottawa was betting it could outrun the damage, that if it moved fast enough to lock in new markets, it could survive without U.S. buyers entirely. Every new contract signed in Europe or Asia was one less reason to come crawling back to the table. Both strategies came with massive risks. For the U.S., the danger was misjudging the clock. Housing affordability was already in crisis, and each month of high material costs pushed more buyers out of the market for good. Builders were canceling projects, construction jobs were drying up, and once those job sites went silent, restarting them wouldn't be quick. For Canada, the danger was absorbing too much short-term pain. Lumber towns in British Columbia and Quebec were feeling the sting of losing their biggest customer. Shipping overseas meant higher costs, more complex logistics, and adapting to different quality standards. But history was on Ottawa's side in one respect. Trade routes, once redrawn, rarely snap back. Mills that close don't reopen just because the political winds change. Buyers that shift to new suppliers often stay there out of habit, convenience, or long-term contractual lock-in. This wasn't just a fight over lumber anymore. It was a race to see who could reshape their market position faster, and the loser wouldn't just take a temporary hit. They'd take a permanent one. By this point, the fight over softwood lumber had become something far larger, a warning sign for how fragile even the closest economic partnerships can be. For decades, U.S.-Canada trade was held up as the model of stability. Deeply integrated supply chains, shared infrastructure, a constant flow of goods crossing the world's longest undefended border. If there was one relationship that seemed too interwoven to fracture, it was this one. But the lumber dispute was proof that even the most unshakable ties can splinter when political agendas take the driver's seat. And the tactics at play here, tariffs, quotas, market diversification, are part of a bigger, more dangerous trend: weaponized trade policy. What's being tested on lumber today could be deployed tomorrow on oil, natural gas, agricultural goods, or even tech components. For Washington, that's a double-edged sword. Yes, tariffs can deliver short-term leverage, but they also encourage trading partners to build alternative supply lines. And once those are in place, America's dominance shrinks. For Ottawa, the lesson is equally sharp. Diversification is power, but it's also costly, and every new market relationship comes with its own demands and vulnerabilities. Some trade analysts believe the only way out is a deal that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago: a multi-year quota system under USMCA, or a suspension of tariffs tied to joint climate and forestry commitments that would give both sides a political win. But neither Washington nor Ottawa seems ready to swallow that pill. The U.S. is holding its tariff line. Canada is holding its diversification course. And every day that passes hardens these positions into something that could define the next era of North American trade. This fight is no longer just about 2x4s or sawmill profits. It's about whether two of the most interconnected economies in the world can survive a trade war without shattering the trust that made them partners in the first place. For Washington, the gamble is that it can use tariffs to force Canada's hand without breaking its own housing market in the process. For Ottawa, the gamble is that it can permanently rewire its export routes before the pain at home becomes politically unbearable. But history is merciless in these situations. Mills that close don't come back. Shipping lanes, once redirected, stay fixed. Buyers who find new suppliers rarely return, not out of disloyalty, but out of habit, stability, and signed contracts. And if this stalemate hardens into permanence, the U.S. will find itself competing for Canadian lumber the same way it competes for oil, grain, or rare earth minerals, on the open market, with no guarantee of preferential access. As the summer heat bakes half-finished frames in idle lumber yards, the symbolism is impossible to miss. The scaffolding of a partnership that once seemed unbreakable now stands exposed, unfinished, and vulnerable. The real question isn't who wins the lumber war, it's whether there will be anything left to win by the time the war is over.